The term was introduced by Neil Stephenson in a science fiction work in 1993 called Snow Crash. And the way he thought of it was that, you know, people led fairly drab lives and they escaped into this metaverse and engaged in thrill-inducing, fast-moving fantasy activities. And in fact, you know, most of what this metaverse is used for is games. And so a lot of the concepts about it and the things that it's really good for, that it's optimized for, are for gaming. And those of you who were present this morning, you know, you saw all sorts of limitations of it because you don't usually do that in the game. You shoot people, you run them down, you're nasty, you're aggressive, you're wild. Well, sitting, talking civilly to people, well, wasn't designed for that. You know, so that's the kind of challenge. Okay, now what I'm going to be doing is looking at two types of platform design, both the design of the technology and of the spaces. So first, the technology. Okay, can we have the next one? Okay, so that's an example of the virtual courtroom, and this was rendered by Volker Sickgast in Austria. In this case, he's using the Unity games. He's now using Unreal. But these were filmed in a green screen room and inserted in the background. But it wasn't done in real time. It's done post-production in the studio. Okay, so I'm going to be looking at the two different types of technology we've been trying out. And some of them, you know about because you've been playing with yourself. And Volker Sickgast has been involved in both of them, but also two other branches of the Fraunhofer Institute in two different parts of Germany. Okay, so the first one, next please, is using multiple screens, multiple cameras, and so this is a diagram. If you've got 4 participants, you need 12 screens, 12 cameras, and everyone needs at least 2 loudspeakers. You need 3 codecs for each side and so on. So it's fairly complicated, but Volker designed it, and Rod Gunn, that some of you saw this morning on the screen, he actually implemented, and we did it twice. First of all, we did a randomized controlled trial, and we set up within a film studio, and then secondly, we did it over the internet, people in 3 different capital cities about 1,000 kilometers apart. So it works very well. Next one. And this is one of the actors sitting in the pods. He played the part of the tribunal manager. And you can see he's got 3 screens in front of him. He turns to one, and the camera's above it, so they make eye contact, turns to the other side, and they make eye contact. And the other people see he's not looking at them. Oh, I've got a breather, and he's telling somebody else I can see. Okay, so that was the so this idea came from Matthias Unbescheiden, who's the Fraunhofer Institute, Darmstadt. And so we've tried this. It works fine. Next one. Skip. And then there's the second technology. And this was one of my son's little sketches in cartoon. And what you can see on one side is a real courtroom, and on the other side, the virtual courtroom. And it basically is designed to look virtually the same. Everybody's in the same position. You just have a curved screen, and your vista is pretty much the same. Now, in this prototype, there's only one screen and one camera. And people join the game as a judge or lawyer or witness. And they see people at the same distance they would be, or the apparent distance they would be in the courtroom. Okay, next please. Okay, and we tried this last week in the Harvard Visualization Lab, and Hannes very kindly agreed to participate in this. And you can see on one side the empty courtroom before we put the avatars in, so you can see what it looks like from well behind the witness, from the audience point of view. And then the second one is from the witness stand, looking forward, and you can see the avatars embedded in position. So that's the kind of view that you get from this virtual court. And you can see there are some things about it, but that's what prototypes are, to learn from. In this case, the avatars turn to one another when you're talking, and so there's a sense of engaged, mutual engagement. Okay, next. And see if you can move down and click towards the bottom, and you'll see there's a the activator with a short video. Go down a bit. Yeah, that's it. Okay, yeah. That's all right. All it does is just a short interchange between people showing that you can, it produces binaural sound, so you can hear it from different angles. And then the avatar turns towards the person speaking. Okay, now here are some of the meta-human avatars available. These available from Unreal, the games engine company. Russ Gant is the head of the visualization research lab at Harvard. Took the one on the right is, he got me to stand in front of it just to show how life-size the avatars are on this enormous screen. So, whereas here you have two flat screens, they've got, it's about the same distance, but it's one long curved screen. So it's like, mostly they show moon landings and they've got really close up to Mars. So they do also, it's part of the geology, really. But somehow they think that law is part of geology because it's so fixated in the past. Okay, so currently the metaverse is a bit like French Canada in the 17th century, optimized for violence rather than the civil discourse Conde argued for. So that, you know, most of the developments in the metaverse are really about playing these kind of violent games suitable for teenagers or people that still feel young enough to engage in sort of fighting. And one of the features of these games is that people appear as avatars. And that's something that is really a challenge. The lawyers are used, in a way, to being a representative of somebody else, not themselves, but acting on behalf of someone else. Judges also have this feeling that they're not the person, they're actually an agent of the state. And so when I presented this to Canadian judges, actually, in St. John's, and I was sort of backing off a bit, saying you'll be horrified and so on. They said, oh, no. We think of our judicial role as having that kind of distance. So we'd like to think more about the sense in which avatars represent us. And one of the beauties of avatars is that generally they use less bandwidth than sending a real image. And so once you get the system going, it actually means the quality of the sound can be higher because more of the bandwidth is devoted to sound. At least that's the hypothesis. You know, if you have really high resolution avatars, maybe that might not work quite so well. Next, please. Now, I'm not sure if this will work. This is something Hannes recorded from the Berlin group of so click it and see. No, sound's not working, so move to the next one. Okay, so anyway, where we're moving potentially is to have a merger of two systems. One is having actual people's faces, representation. You know, it's not the video is real, it's just a set of pixels that's scrambled and unscrambled and sent across a wire and combined, but it appears to be real. So combining that with the avatar system and using what's called volumetric video, which is you see it in 3D, you can walk right around. And so the Fraunhofer people in Berlin are working on that, and they did a little skit for us showing a witness and went around and okay. So let's stay on this one. Now we're moving towards the metaverse, and you can see most of the current versions look pretty tacky, I have to say. And this is both from Microsoft and Meta. And you know, they're playful and interesting. They're familiar to people who play games, but they don't seem to be quite as useful if you're trying to have a serious meeting or a hearing. But last year alone, Meta put in over $10 billion into what they call their metaverse. So it's highly likely that $10 billion a year, they might do a slightly better job than Fraunhofer does with 5,000. But we'll see. And there could well be a convergence, and maybe they'll want to buy whatever product that we produce. And, you know, and we'll say Hannes did it from here, and he can have all the money. You have to take all the money? Okay, well, I'll tell you. But one of the kind of really serious issues that comes out of this is who controls the metaverse. Because what we're doing is developing something using open source and making it available to anybody and not charging for it. But really, the big companies want to make a killing, but they also want to control the market. And they've got all sorts of techniques, in the Apple Store and so on, for managing the market and taking the cut. And so, and I know Kareem and the Subjustice Lab are very careful about thinking about how do we make things accessible to justice systems generally without them getting ripped off by big companies. So it is a very important question about who controls the metaverse, and how we develop things that are sustainable in the long run. Well, as you can see, you know, these are prototypes, and there's lots of work to be done. In fact, this morning, several of you gave very useful suggestions, so thank you very much, and we'll work on those. So they're technical ones, but there's also social ones about accessibility, fairness, efficiency, and then the type of equipment that's most accessible to people. And generally what we're saying is don't just assume everybody can do things on their iPhone. Might be, if you're doing something that's a bit more special, you go to special rooms. And our preference is to have public facilities like libraries, schools, community centres and so on that are available for people to use for justice purposes, but probably more for health and education purposes. But it's an intermediate thing between going to a big courtroom, which is enormous rooms and costs $3,000 an hour for a hearing, to sitting in the bedroom in front of an iPad. This is the intermediate one where you go into a space that's quite comfortable and well designed, but it's not too expensive. Okay, next one. Okay, well, let's turn to court buildings. And this is something that I'm really interested in. I've been wandering around court buildings for about 20 years now. We've run 5 or 6 court architecture tours, and we're going to run another one in 2024 in the Netherlands, France. And they're really designed that people walk, when you walk around, you talk to different people sitting in a conference theatre. You see things, and particularly if you walk with architects, because they see all sorts of things that I would never see. And courthouses are kind of very interesting. They're complex spaces. This is one in Montpellier. Very interesting architect who fled to France to escape the Nazis. He was Jewish, and he mostly spent his career building public housing. So he has this idea of how to make things accessible to ordinary people. And so this courthouse in Montpellier follows that. It's all the spaces are relatively intimate. And one of the things he did was, he said, the quality of the furniture in the cells ought to be equivalent to that elsewhere in the courthouse. So in order to show how important it is to look after the most vulnerable. So anyway, there's it's a great courthouse, but all courthouses are based on lots of hierarchy and zones. In fact, I think Linda Mulcahy might be speaking in the series later, and she talks a lot about how British courts are, totally overridden by segregations. So the courts are very complicated places, and they have all these hierarchies. I heard a story by John Denton, who's an Australian architect, who's designing the Manchester Civil Courthouse in England, and he showed the judges this wonderful courthouse, and then one of the judges came up to him and he said, "Oh, those car parks," and he said, "What's about car? They're all the same length." And he said, "Sorry, how do you mean they're all the same length?" And he said, "We're High Court judges. We have Rolls Royces. Those other judges only drive Toyotas. We need longer car parks." And I said, "Oh, thank you very much. I didn't realise there was that even parking spaces had hierarchies." So those are the kind of things that you learn about courts. And, there's a bit of an echo there. Does it sound okay? Yeah. Okay. Well, the spatial, the space of a courthouse it's got lots of different spaces. And what we've been talking about so far is just hearing. We also need to add all sorts of additional rooms, lawyers to talk to their clients, judges to deliberate, and there may be mediation rooms. You've got a civil dispute. What judges often do is say, "Hey, you guys, go next door, sort it out. I'm back and tell you what we've decided." So we might need to design a whole lot of other rooms. But one of the important points I think about when you think about the metaverse, and this idea comes from Matthew Ball, who's written a book called The Metaverse and How It Will Revolutionize Everything. It just came out in 2022. It's got some good reviews and some bad reviews, which means it's challenging. But one of the points he says, as technology developed, they started in the virtual world copying the legacy system. So he said that when Apple started iPhones, they used icons that copied the real world. So books, they had a book on a bookshelf, and with notes they had a yellow hat. And he said, after 2013, they abandoned their legacy system, and they were brave enough to move into the new world. And so what I'm arguing is that we should consider that the legacy system used in courts, the technology, the spaces, the rituals, could all be rethought in this new world. And in fact, Richard Susskind put it like that. We need to radically design our court systems and put in place a new configuration of people, processes, technology, and physical spaces. And so my way of, yes, okay, so the next one. Okay, now you see that's the kind of thing we don't want in the metaverse.
People online aren't hearing you properly, okay. Hence the feedback. So this is the sort of thing we want to avoid. Obviously you don't need docs in the virtual court, but it's this type of prejudice that means that there is a real space for virtual courts. In fact, the reason I got into this whole thing in the first place was I was asked to be an expert witness in a terrorism trial. And I wasn't actually an expert. I didn't really know anything about terrorism, even though I terrorised my young brothers and sisters at the time. And so I had to go and read everything I could about the design of spaces. Now I'm going to put these
alleged terrorists in a glass cage in court, which they do in Canada all the time, except in Nova Scotia, the only province that states. So I went and presented, all the evidence, and the judge sort of shrugged his shoulders after I talked and said, well, you haven't got any really strong evidence about it. But my impression as a judge is when that person walks through the glass cage to the witness box, they look pretty scary to me. So if I as a judge react that way, then surely the jury would. So he ordered the glass pulled down, and I later became a friend of him on the New South Wales Sentencing Council, and he said to me, why don't we do a randomised controlled trial? And so we did. The New South Wales government gave us the courtroom. We did a trial, and we can show that if you appear in any sort of age or doc, you're 1.8 times more likely to be found guilty. Okay, and then we repeated that using a virtual court type of environment, and there's no prejudice at all appearing on the screen. So that's my background. That's why I got interested in this in terms of protecting human rights. Anyway, so what I'm going to do now is turn from courts to look at 3 different types of inspiration. They're actually inspiration that I learned from architects that might have hints about the appropriate metaphors or models for courts of the future. And these 3 are arcades, health facilities, and gardens. So next please. Okay, so this is a typical arcade in Melbourne. Melbourne has all sorts of beautiful arcades. They're covered laneways or alleyways that offer pedestrians refuge from the bland world of the department store and escape from roads clogged with vehicles. They may be busy, but the busyness is at a small scale, human level. At their best, arcades, such as those in Melbourne, comprise intimate small spaces, well-curated displays, and personal engagements between imaginative retailers and curious consumers. The County Court in Melbourne uses the arcade as the model for its jury space, the jury assembly. So if we are thinking of a court in virtual reality, we don't need any of those tangled network of corridors and circulation zones. But if we think of it as a series of meeting places, resting spots, and services along simple arcades, that's one way to think about how we could design this court of the future. It's a laneway that promises shelter from the violent and turbulent world outside. Okay, so that's one example. Next one, please. Okay, so the second example is of a healing space, the hospital. And there's a lot of research about, far more research about hospitals than courts. People want to make courts fearsome places and make sure they're all secure. They don't actually look at the effect it has on people's psyches, whereas they do on hospitals. And there's good research that shows that if you're recovering from an operation and you have a view of trees, you're more likely to be cured more quickly and you use fewer painkilling drugs than if the window has a view of a brick wall. So we know that. We also know that seeing flowers and smelling the fragrance of cypress and lavender, having low background noise, maybe a little bit of water movement, these reduce stress and contribute to healing. Also having legible buildings and don't get lost, you know where you're going. That reduces stress. So it is privacy. And so we know that health facilities, natural light, good ventilation, and indoor plants also improves the staff productivity. So there's all sorts of practical financial reasons why hospitals use these so-called biophilic designs. And so all the best new hospitals use these principles. Yeah, in fact, the earliest psychiatric hospitals were based on the idea that doctors were pretty much useless and drugs hadn't been invented yet. And so they put people with views of nature. And so, in fact, my office building in Sydney is an old psychiatric hospital built on this principle. So at the far end, you put the people that are really crazy and they shout a lot and scream. And as they get saner
they move them towards the centre. Now, my office, unfortunately, is towards the centre, so I think they misdiagnosed. But, you know, so there has been a long history in hospital and healthcare design of thinking about the effect on emotion and on healing. Now, we should think of courts and justice as also being healing processes. We're trying to restore social dislocation, end cycles of violence, and heal fractured relationships. So if you really think what courts are, then, you know, don't think of them as punitive, thinking of them as healing spaces, then they're more likely to be successful. Okay, next one. Now, the third model of justice, the third metaphor, if you like, is about nature. And this is quite a famous one. Deborah, in the book of Judges in the Hebrew Bible, she delivered justice under a palm tree. Samuel, who was really famous in French justice, resolved disputes under an oak tree. That's why oak is used so effectively in both French and English courts. And Somali traditional law operated under the shadow of an acacia. So the idea of justice in natural environments is a long tradition. And indeed, the Federal Court of Australia, when it's hearing land rights claims, it sometimes holds them on riverbanks. So anyway, there's a lot of different spaces there. There's three different metaphors. Next, please. And now, if we're thinking of a justice precinct, we don't want to think like the Greeks and Romans did of just a building that's in your face. It's better, with European architects, to think of using Japanese or Islamic models where you wander around, you slowly get into the mood, so you become psychologically prepared to enter the court. So here's a couple of examples of, you know, little spaces you could imagine and create, and you walk through these spaces to, in fact, the appeal court of Malmö in Sweden is designed with that principle in mind. You walk around before you get to the front end, so by the time you get there, you're really calm. And they seem to stay calm inside, not just because they're Swedish, but because they have beautiful big stand-up desks, and that keeps them more lively, and have lovely meeting spaces, and they have lots of community. Okay, now let's come to waiting areas. Next. Now this is a court in South Australia that has a lot of Indigenous users, and they have a bit of a problem in that, you know, with colonialisation in Canada, often brought different Indigenous groups together who've been trying to stay apart for thousands of years, and they crammed them together in the same space and said, now get on. And, you know, probably take another 1,000 years to work, but in the meantime, they're creating these courts and they have separate waiting areas outside the court. So that if the different groups more from the hills or the plains want to come to court, then they don't get to cross paths with other people. But the idea of having outside spaces is important. I realise in Montreal there's a couple of weeks a year when you might not want to sit outside for long periods of time, but at least the concept might be appealing to. Okay, now let's go to a more formal space. Next one, please. So if you're going to have a meeting, you might want to have some sort of structure, but it doesn't need to be formal. It could well be a gazebo or a kiosk. And this is just one way. A park near where I live, you know, playing cricket near it. Occasionally it gets hit by lightning, so it's a good place to shop. So that's the kind of concept. It could be for a small meeting, mediation space or something. You use a kiosk outside rather than thinking of it as being part of a larger building. Or if you want more inside spaces, then you might have a huge view of outside areas, such as in this Coffs Harbour Courthouse in New South Wales, designed by Diane Jones, co-convener of the Kura Future Network, or this Tongan tapestry, or tapa, in Manukau, South Auckland, that was given by the Tongan community. And so that's used in the family court. They say that, you know, it respects the traditions of the local people. And it's more important to do that than to show the colonial past that you would by showing coats of arms. Where the person themselves are, where's their body? And this is an image in the county court in Melbourne that I mentioned before. They gave us the some courtrooms and meeting spaces for studying about the distributed courtroom. And so what we did is we had an architecture PhD student, and we gave her $20, told her to go to IKEA and bring back a whole furniture to design this room. So this is the result. And so it's a beautiful, comfortable room, bright furniture, tapestry, views of nature, some of the people with their handbags, all sorts of just little features. And everybody loved it. We randomly assigned people to this room or the regular room that was used for remote witnesses. With this one, they kind of almost slumped back and fell asleep. They were so comfortable. In the regular room, people felt so nervous that we just about needed to appoint a counsellor. And all they were just regular research subjects answering a few simple questions. So, you know, space does make a difference. So it's important to think about these spaces. You know, judges and lawyers, they're going to be sitting, it's going to be their offices or places that they're going to spend a lot of time. So they need to be beautifully designed. So it could be their own office, or it could be on the office on the floor, somewhere on the same level as them, a special dedicated space that's available for them. And the other thing about professionals is they do need second advice. So while we have a beautiful big screen for them to see the virtual court, it's more efficient for them. And I told the federal court judge I watched, he had a separate device for all his other stuff. You know, he was constantly checking the legislation to see if the lawyers that were talking to him had quoted it right. He was looking at the latest precedents. He was checking the background papers people had submitted. He was looking at correspondence. He was basically doing quite a few multitasking while the lawyers were presenting their work. And that's necessary for him to carry out his job. Okay, next thing. Yeah, there's lots of good ways in which courts and other institutions can use space and where to hold meetings. Now, even though I've been slagging Facebook a little bit, one thing they're really good at, and Nicola came to this, is that they hold a lot of the meetings on their roof. So they have this magnificent space on their roof with all these little garden enclaves where people gather and do the work. And so that's a good example. So even though in the virtual world, Meta stuffs it up quite a lot, in the real world, they do a really good job. Quite an interesting paradox, isn't it? So what I'm arguing really is that we need to test out some of these type of things and see how people respond to them. I know often when we do studies, you give people questionnaires and they tell you, based on their past experience, what they think. So for example, in Italy, people gave the images of various courts. And some were really, you know, old Roman ones with great big pillars, and others were modernist ones, really tough. And virtually everybody said, oh no, those are real courts, those old archaic courts. And we're saying that actually this idea that only these old-fashioned buildings are real courts and the judges with wigs or gowns or other archaic clothing are real judges, and other judges don't have real authority. We're saying that's just weasel words. That's not based on any real experimental evidence. What we really need to do is give people experience of this other world in which they're treated in a dignified way, respectfully, which they can understand the process, and then say to them, how did you experience that? We just show them a bunch of avatars in a virtual environment. They'll say, that's not the real court. But if they engaged in a process, then they might actually feel like it was quite different. But it won't be perfect. There'll be mistakes that we make, and we need to learn them. But we shouldn't assume by giving people questionnaires and tapping their prejudices about the past that we will actually be able to successfully build the future. So let's draw some of these threads together. You know, what I've been talking about is the importance of design and the way it impacts on behaviour and experience. And we don't know that in advance. We can make predictions about what the metaverse will do and what these technologies enable, but we won't really know until we test it out. And in testing it out, we'll use the principle they actually use at Harvard Business School, medical school, when they start. They say, half of the things you learn here will turn out to be wrong. We just don't know which part. So I think that's the approach to take when we're building these type of technologies. You know, and I realise it's probably only 10% things when you do something like justice, because you've got such a really good mind. But with this type of thing, it probably will be 50% of things don't work properly. You have to be a little bit more humble than you really are and make the necessary changes. But what we can say is that there's a lot of push, a lot of demand for this type of thing. People have been in Zoom boxes and hate it. Far too stressful, it doesn't work, and they can't see people. So mostly lawyers say, we want to go back to real courts. That's where it's at. And what we can say is, yes, sure, in many things that would be appropriate. But there will be some occasions, that's exactly which ones, where this intermediate solution will be better. And it's an intermediate solution which we're not going to be, it's not going to be on the cheap, we're not going to be sitting in your bathroom looking at an iPhone. You'll be going into a specially designed room with a nice wide screen and good graphics card and comfortable seat. And if you're a judge, you'll probably have a higher seat, and it's a little bit more important. And then that sort of environment will produce a more agreeable outcome. But some of the justice processes will become more concentrated because it is more possible to have things in one place. Things like tax appeals, license reinstatement, copyright disputes. You probably have them all centralised in one part of the jurisdiction. But other things will be more dispersed. Like we have a whole range of kiosks all over the place. It'll make it more possible for people to take part, not necessarily in a full trial, but in some parts of the process. And some of these kiosks or various places will look like arcades or gardens. So we can't foresee what's going to happen in the future with the metaverse, but our responsibility is to ensure that we do so in a way that promotes fairness and justice by using our collective imagination to help create new rituals and design new spaces. Perhaps we can take inspiration from Kondiaronk and other Indigenous leaders of this continent and design these new justice spaces in a way that promotes reconciliation rather than asserts state power. Thank you for the technical people. That's possible.
So, thank you, David. Thank you, Professor Tait. As you'll understand, the people online and as most people in the room here know, Professor Tait and myself have been collaborating for a number of years at this point, so it's very difficult to call him Professor Tait rather than my good friend David. Normally, my colleague Kevin Beniclef would have been here in my stead to say a few words before opening the floor up to questions. Unfortunately, he was delayed, so he apologizes, and I apologize on his behalf for not being here. But at the same time, I'm not going to say I'm happy he's not here. That's not the case. But it does please me to be able to say a few words, because a lot of what you've discussed are things that I myself am working on as well, and therefore raises a lot of issues that I've dealt with in my research, and a lot of questions that I've struggled with as well. Starting with the whole idea that you mentioned of what a real court is. And I find it fascinating that we have very little hindsight when it comes to how justice is being rendered. And this is almost the opposite of what we see with technology. There's in artificial intelligence, there's this issue that they say, well, anything that existed when you were born, that's not artificial intelligence because you're familiar with it. Artificial intelligence is any new technology that you don't understand. And that's a very obviously obtuse way of looking at it. And it feels like justice is basically, well, following a similar trend where you say justice is what exists when I require justice or when I've been studying it or during my lifetime. And anything that happened before that wasn't really justice. Because when you referred to this saying justice that was being dealt under a tree or in certain areas, or if you go back to medieval times, it was in the public square, or it was in marketplaces, or on the front step of the local church. And it's only in the 19th century, in fact, that the courtroom as we know it today actually was created. Before that, courtroom architecture was very different. And then what we know now, and in fact, a few years ago, I was a visiting professor at the University of William and Mary, which is on the same land as Colonial Williamsburg in the US. And Colonial Williamsburg, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is basically a village that was frozen in time in the 1770s. And the courthouse there is obviously extremely different than it is here, for example. So there, the audience, if you will, actually sits behind the judge, and the judge will turn around and consult them. And the parties are not sitting at tables. They have to go up the stairs, and they stand in this little cage almost on either side of the courtroom. So the structure is very different, and that was only 300 years ago. It's not like it was a whole eternity. And therefore, we see that when we're talking about a real court, well, what we're talking about actually is just the court as we know it, because it's the court that we know. But just because we know something doesn't necessarily mean it's the way things should be. And we just have to look back at what we were doing 15, 20 years ago when I was much younger than I am right now, and unfortunately had way more hair than I do now, to realize that a lot of our former habits we realized are horrible and that we changed them. And so the idea of reproducing simply existing infrastructures online, if we're talking about a virtual court, and that's what we're trying to do, and that's what we've been trying to do with technology in general within the legal system. If you just look at online dispute resolution, the first trials, if you will, of online dispute resolution was basically taking exactly what we do in real life and transferring it online. And if you do that, yes, you transfer all the good, but you also transfer all the bad. And therefore, looking at those examples, well, we already know that we shouldn't simply copy and paste what happens in real life and bring it online. We should take advantage of what the technology offers us. And one thing the technology offers us is that we can build the most beautiful courtroom at no extra cost. You don't have to pay for the expensive materials or the architecture or so on. You can really go wild and choose the environment that you want. And so having this online court, talking about a court in the metaverse, well, not only is it not that crazy, in fact, it's not even that novel. In fact, if you just go back to, what was it, 2006, 2007, there was this thing called Second Life. Now, some of you might remember it, some might not. When Second Life came out, it was this huge revolution. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, Second Life was this online virtual space where you could basically build anything you wanted, and it was just an environment where you could interact with anybody online. And so people built space stations and stores and courthouses. A lot of American universities actually built moot courts in Second Life, and they would have trials in that environment. Obviously, the technology back then wasn't as advanced as it is now, so the avatars weren't as realistic. You couldn't actually speak to one another, you couldn't text to one another. And so the technology is much better now, but you already had a proof of concept, if you will, at that time, that this was obviously possible. Now, obviously, there are those that are going to say, yes, but using avatars has numerous drawbacks, and the main one obviously being, well, I can't read the nonverbal language of the people I'm dealing with. Well, and this is an argument that I've heard a lot every time we talk about online dispute resolution, every time we talk about the dematerialization of justice. That's one of the main criteria or the main critiques that always comes back. Yes, but what about the nonverbal language? And I always like to come back to a quote from Justice Easterbrook, who said that the same Justice Easterbrook who had the whole debate on the law of the horse years back with, I have a blank now, with, who was he having that debate with? Lessig, Larry Lessig. And so that's a side note, but Justice Easterbrook, who actually studied nonverbal language, said that those who claim that it's an issue are heavily reliant on dubious folk knowledge. And what he meant by that is that we are actually very bad as human beings at reading nonverbal language. And therefore, we're putting a lot of stock into something that, in fact, we're not very good at. And so we come out of the courtroom thinking, oh, that person was guilty because he looked guilty. Well, no, he may have simply looked nervous because he was in a court environment that he was absolutely not familiar with. And so by removing that and using avatars, I think it's an interesting idea, yes, for the judges, for the reasons you mentioned. And I would add to that the question of anonymity for judges. About a decade ago in the UK, it came out in the papers that the government had decided that they would cease paying for wigs for judges. And you'd think that people would say, well, yeah, the wigs are a little old-fashioned. Probably we could move beyond it. Here in Quebec, we don't wear the wigs, and our legal system isn't worse off because of it. But judges were scandalized, and they said, no, you can't take the wigs away from us, because they are granting us a certain form of anonymity. And that way, when we leave the courthouse, people don't recognize us because we're not wearing the wigs. So the wig is a way to protect the judges. Now, obviously, that's not why wigs were created, and that's why not all the judges are wearing wigs. But it is interesting to see that, well, you could solve the same issue with the avatars and have the judges now be somewhat anonymous. As for the parties, well, we all know that judges, as every other human being, are biased. We know that if we have a person that looks like us in front of us, we are more, there's a bigger chance that we will be more open-minded to their issues. And that looks like us doesn't necessarily mean it's a question of race or sex. It could just simply be somebody that has the same upbringing or somebody that went to the same university, or just when you go abroad and you're walking down the street and you hear somebody who has the same accent you do, you turn around and you start talking to that person. You would never speak to that person if you were walking down the street in Montreal and heard them speak, but because you're two countrymen in France or in Italy or wherever on the globe, all of a sudden you feel this kinship. And that there are studies that demonstrate that that happens in the courtroom all the time. And it's, again, not because judges are bad people or not because judges have a particular bias and they are not just, simply because judges have this huge flaw of being human and therefore of being subject to the same issues as every other human. And another element that you referred to that I thought was particularly interesting is that of comfort. And I worked last year with the IRB, the Immigration Refugee Board of Canada, and they asked me to conduct a study for them on basically an audit of their use of Teams to hold online trials. So Teams, the platform for video conferencing. And so I surveyed a certain number of users, and what I found fascinating is that most individuals, so the people who were asking either for refugee status or for immigration status, they loved the idea of doing this from home. And one of the reasons they gave is, well, I'm in my own things, I'm in my living room, I know my environment, so I'm more comfortable, I'm more at ease, and it's easier to interact. What's interesting is if you ask their representatives, they all thought it was a horrible idea for them to stay home. They said, no, they should be in the courthouse. And they should be, well, not in the courthouse, but in the hearing room. Now, obviously, it wasn't that categorical, but the statistics coming from people who appeared in front of the IRB versus their representatives were quite desperate. There was a quite important distinction between the two. Like 10% margin between the two, if I recall. And the last element I wanted to get to, and then I'll give you a chance if you want to answer some of these issues, and if not, we'll simply go to questions in the audience, is you mentioned, well, who controls the metaverse? And I think that is probably one of the most important issues when you're talking about core technology. And it brings me back to Ethan Katz and his theory on the fourth party in mediation. So just to give you a little background for those of you who aren't familiar with Ethan's work, basically when you have a negotiation between the two individuals, you have two parties to the negotiation, right? The claimant and the respondent, if you want to use legal terms. And then if you have a mediator that joins that session, or even an arbitrator, or even a judge, well, that is a third party in this procedure, so a third individual taking part in the discussions and in the negotiations or mediation, or if it's a trial, obviously, the judge then will impose his or her will. But what Ethan mentioned is that when you have technology, when you add technology to the equation, if you're doing this through an online platform, well, that online platform becomes a party in the sense that it can allow you to do certain things, it can stop you from doing certain things, and therefore it's going to have an important impact on the outcome of the case. The easiest example to illustrate this is Twitter. Right, Twitter stops you at, 280 characters, I believe. So yeah, if you have a statement that you want to make that is 284 characters, tough luck. You either send 2 tweets or you send 1 tweet and you make a few spelling or grammar mistakes in order to fit the time, the constraints of Twitter. Now, tweets are one thing, but if you have the same type of constraints within a platform that you're using to communicate with opposing counsel or the opposing party or with the court, well, that's obviously going to generate issues because you can't put all your information out there, and therefore that might mean that you lose your trial or lose your case because you weren't able to present all the facts the way you wanted to. And so when you're talking about the metaverse, well, the metaverse now becomes the fourth party in the sense that, well, if there's a glitch with the platform, if for some reason the sound isn't right, if for some reason your avatar isn't pleasing to the eye as much as the other avatar, well, all of this could have an impact. And therefore, who controls the metaverse becomes extremely important, just like who controls the courtroom is when you're talking about in-person hearings. And so just a couple of thoughts here that came to mind as I was listening to you. And obviously, I could probably go on for hours, but I don't want to do that to the people either online or in this room. And so, David, I don't know if you have any comments on what I just said. If you do, I believe you can take the mic that's at the table there. You don't necessarily have to stand.
Okay, can you hear me?
Oh, well, okay, it's probably easier to hear them.
Okay, thanks very much, Nicola, for your thoughtful comments. I'll just make a few points. First of all, in relation to Ethan captured you about the platform being the fourth party. The way to generalize that idea of it is using Latour's concept of all the different elements that go to make a human interaction, forming some sort of assemblage. Now, that certainly includes the technology, but it also includes the rituals and traditions. So it's not just the people interacting, there's all these other things that are there as part of the process. And sometimes these traditions are the things that block progress, and then all of a sudden you have a pandemic and you get a whole new experience. Or you wait until one generation dies, which was Thomas Kuhn's point about what a revolution, scientific revolution required. Okay, so this idea of assemblages, which takes very seriously the technology as well as the rituals. The second thing about people preferring to be at home, that's actually quite a profound point. And there's some architectural theory based on Heidegger that looks at this concept of the home and how you try to create homely spaces in various places. And obviously, it could be in courts too. And it ties into the Freudian distinction between Heimlich and Unheimlich. That there's something that you feel comfortable and secure in, almost back in the womb, and then unheimlich, something that's strange and alien and foreign to you. So how to create a homely type of environment that's not too overly familiar. That's one of the interesting challenges in the metaverse. And then just one flippant point about wigs. In Australia, the rule now, at least in Victoria, about wigs is it's up to the judge presiding over each case whether they wear a wig or not. And it turns out that the women judges, and there's a majority of them now, have actually quite nice hair, and they don't want to wear a wig to destroy it. Whereas the men are a little bit like Nicola, we haven't got so much, and so they wear wigs to cover their baldness. So generally, what you find is when there's a woman presiding, and then the lawyers don't wear wigs, the judge does. And so if the woman's presiding, no wigs, the man's presiding, wigs.